Right, hi guys, it is Dan here, and something a little bit different today. I haven't had a chance to get an awful lot of reading done this week because it is haymaking season, and I've just got a new tractor, and I've been spending like, I don't know, 14 hours a day just like cutting grass. So that's really been cutting into my video time, if you pardon the pun. So if you didn't read the video title before you clicked on this, I'm going to be going through my favourite fantasy series. Now, what I've done here is I've split it into, like, first of all, I want to say all of these series that I'm going to mention are fantastic, but I've split it into two tiers. I've got my sort of like absolute top favourites that are brilliant and I would highly recommend to anyone, and then I've got like my second tier which I still think are brilliant. So I'm not saying these are bad series, but they're just not quite as good as my absolute favourite ones. So with that said, also I've only included one book or series from every author. I'm not doubling up on authors. So if I haven't included, so for example, I've only included one Tolkien work. I've not included like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion and blah 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 whatever. I've included one of them. That doesn't mean the rest aren't great. It just means I'm only doing one per author, because otherwise there'd be like a billion books in this. So with that all said, and in no particular order, the first, I'm going to start with the second tier, the sort of slightly, not less good, the still fantastic, but not my absolute favourite series. And the first one of them, just picking one at random, is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And this is the first book in the First Law trilogy, and it is representative of this whole trilogy. I've recently re-listened to I read it in physical form. I've recently re-listened to it on audiobook, and if anything, listening to it on the audiobook again has improved my appreciation of it. I thought it was really good already. This is, like, for me, the epitome of character-driven, grim, dark fantasy. All the characters are super fleshed out, in depth. The plot itself is pretty typical, I think, for a fantasy series, but it's the characters that really make this. You've got some really great ones. Glocta, who's this like inquisitor guy who's been crippled and like tortured, and now he inflicts all this on other people. You've got Logan Ninefingers, who's this like awesome barbarian guy who actually doesn't like fighting that much, just goes mental sometimes. I mean, yeah, really great characters in this, so definitely recommend that if you're into character driven fantasy. Next up, we've got one that I've never heard anyone talk about this before, and I imagine that a lot of people won't have heard of this. And this is kind of a historical fantasy. It's by an Icelandic author called Snorri Kristjansson. It's called The Swords of Good Men. It's the first one in a series that I think is called the Valhalla Saga. I think, anyway. But anyway, Swords of Good Men is the first one. It's Viking era historical fantasy. It starts off and you think it's just going to be historical fiction, and then the second and third books, because this is a trilogy, move into some serious fantasy elements. And this is kind of a crossover for me. I like my historical fiction, I like my fantasy. This covers both worlds, and it's really well written. I thought it starts strong, definitely. The next one is, this is a bit of a blast from the past for me. This is a series that I got into because they had them like in my school library when I was like a teenager, and the only other fantasy I'd read at that point was like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but this is sort of science fantasy. It's by McCaffrey, and it is the Dragonriders of Pern series. There's a bunch of books in this series, and I guess nowadays it might be sort of put under young adult, but that didn't exist when I was a young adult, so It was just fantasy. But the concept is that humans have gone and colonised this other planet, and then they've genetically engineered some of the native life forms into dragons that they then fly around to deal with this alien threat that sort of threatens the planet that they're on. So you've got this kind of juxtaposition of, you know, fantasy elements like dragons, and then like, you know, modern, or well, not even modern, like futuristic sort of like high-tech equipment for like farming and construction and stuff like that. And yeah, it's a really interesting dichotomy. It's a really interesting world, and Anne McCaffrey is just a really readable writer. So yeah, definitely some nostalgia there for me, and also the cover art on all of the paperbacks that I've got is really good. Right, next, and this may be a controversial pick, but I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. It's The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, and this is a book that gets a lot of love on sort of like booktube fantasy channels, right? And I absolutely understand that. If you, again, this is like the Joe Abercrombie one, this is really great character-driven fantasy. There's some great rapport between the characters. The camaraderie between the main characters is brilliant. It's got a very interesting plot. It's like a heist novel, like an Ocean's 11 type thing. And the setting as well is quite unique, or well, maybe. Certainly from what I've read for a fantasy genre. It's like a Renaissance Italy kind of setting. And I did really enjoy this when I read it. The only reason I haven't put this in the top tier, and it was very tight, the only reason I haven't put it in is because there are so far 3 books in the series, and the 4th one is about to be released. And I've only read the first one. I do own the second one. I just haven't got around to it yet, but I plan to very soon. And if the quality continues throughout the series, then that may well push it up the rankings. But for the moment, anyway, this is definitely recommended. The Lies of Locke Lamora, the first in the Gentleman Bastard sequence by Scott Lynch. And next up, we've got one that I know is going to be controversial for not making the top tier. But like I say, that doesn't mean it's not good. These are all fantastic, like, series. And the one that I'm going for now is The Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. This is the first book, The Eye of the World. This is an absolute... I mean, you've got to read this if you're into fantasy, I think. It's like a huge 14-book series, 15 books if you include the prequel novella. And yeah, this is like one of the absolute, you know, classic fantasy series of all time. If you're into fantasy and you haven't heard of this, then that's weird. But anyway, it follows Rand al'Thor, who is like a farm boy who is the chosen one and has to battle the Dark Lord to save the world and the entire of, you know, time and whatever. But like I say, I did really enjoy this series overall. The reason it doesn't make it into my top tier, the 2 reasons it doesn't make it into my top tier is, number 1, and this is a personal taste thing, is like the chosen one trope is not my favourite trope. I don't mind it, but it's, you know, fine, but I'm not that bothered about it. The second reason, and the more important reason, and I think this is kind of, I don't know if it's universally accepted, but it's a widely accepted issue with this series, is that the middle sort of maybe 5 books or something of the 14 books are a bit of a slog to get through. And, you know, and all of the books are like 1,000 pages long, so if you've got 5,000 pages of slog to get through, I'm afraid that can't make the top tier for me. But, I mean, if you're into fantasy, you do have to read this, I think. And the next one I've got is, again, this is one that I've never really seen people talk about, and I just picked it up at a charity shop, but I ended up really enjoying it. It's a duology. It's the Empty Throne duology by Daniel Polansky. This is the first book. It's called Those Above. The second book is called Those Below. And basically, you've got these sort of, you know, fantasy, sort of superhuman, almost godlike creatures who sort of rule the world, and then humans are like kind of their slaves, I guess. And some of the humans are accepting of this. They believe that it's their place in the world. Some of them are very much not accepting of this. And the humans have like their own kingdoms and stuff as well, but definitely these above guys are the ones in charge. So there's a very interesting sort of class system dynamic, and you've got this whole rebellion going on. But yeah, there's some really great characters in this. The world it's a very sort of unique concept I've not come across before. And I just found it really engrossing. And like I say, I don't think it gets a lot of love. I've not seen anyone talk about it before, so yeah, I'm putting it out there. The Empty Throne duology by Daniel Polansky. Read it. Right, now with that dealt with, we can move on to the absolute top tier of fantasy. And this is all a personal taste thing. And if something that you really like hasn't appeared in this list, then I would really love to hear about it. Please give me your recommendations. Chances are I've just not read it. There's a bunch of stuff that I've never read, loads of it. But the first book in my top tier of fantasy novels or series, whatever, is these are brilliant. Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. This is the first book, The Colour of Magic. Talking about the Dragonriders series with the cover art. The cover art on the Discworld series is just like the best. It's brilliant. But this is something a bit different in the fantasy genre. I've certainly never seen anything else like it. If you have, then that is the same quality, then please let me know. But this is like a fantasy comedy. It's like a fantasy absurdist comedy series. And it's all set in the same world, but it doesn't necessarily... And there's a lot of recurring characters, but it's not like a series in the sense that it's a continuous storyline. There's a bunch of different stuff going on. Terry Pratchett just chooses what he wants to write about within the world, and comes up with some absolute comedy gems all through the way. This is one of the very few series or books, full stop, that makes me laugh out loud when I'm reading it. I've got embarrassed in public laughing out loud to this before. So yeah, if you want a bit of a change up from your typical like, I've got to concentrate so much epic fantasy stuff, then this is a real good one. And there's also some, there's a bit of satire in there as well, so you can read into it a bit if you want. But yeah, really, it's like, just good for anyone who wants a good laugh. Right, now, this is a series enough. Now, there's only a couple of books in it so far. There's 2 main novels in the series and 1 novella, which I recently read. And that is the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the first book, The Name of the Wind. There's the second one is The Wise Man's Fear, and those are both like massive, beefy tomes, like just hundreds and hundreds of pages in them. The thing that really it's pretty typical. I say it's pretty typical. I mean, you follow the life story of just one guy who is like just bloody good at everything, and we don't know what happens at the end because it's supposed to be a trilogy, but only the first 2 books have been released. It's a bit of a George R.R. Martin Game of Thrones thing where who knows when the next book's going to come out. But yeah, you follow this one guy, and it looks like it's going to turn out to be a tragedy where he's bloody good at everything, but still can't save the world because he's telling his own story in these books, and he's just like an innkeeper. So obviously something's happened. But the thing that really makes this series stand out for me is Patrick Rothfuss's writing style. He's got a super unique voice in the fantasy world, I think, and I absolutely love his prose. The thing that, I've recently read the novella, the Slow Regard of Silent Things, which is based in the same world as this series and based on a character that appears in this. It's only 150 pages long, but honestly, that is one of the just most beautifully written entries in the fantasy genre that I think I've ever read, and it's my favourite book that I've read so far this year. You can check out my review of that if you want. But yeah, so the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. If you just like really beautifully written stuff, then definitely read this. Right, now back into possibly a bit of controversy. I have decided for my J.R.R. Tolkien pick to go for not The Hobbit, not The Lord of the Rings. I decided to go for the Silmarillion. This is my favourite book in the whole of the sort of Middle-earth. I don't know what the word is. The whole of the Middle-earth, you know, whatever he's written about them. Canon. The whole of the Middle-earth canon. I think that's the term. And this book, right, so everyone knows The Hobbit, everyone knows The Lord of the Rings. This is sort of a mythological history of that entire world, of the whole of Middle-earth. Everything that led up to the Hobbit, from literally the creation of the world up until those events, is in this book. And I love it. This is my favourite Tolkien book. I have read it just so many times, and it really is just the best example of just pure world building that I've ever read. You know, if you do like world building, if that's a big part of why you enjoy reading fantasy, then you have to read the Silmarillion. You absolutely have to read it. You know, it doesn't do a lot else. It is pure world building. But if you like, you know, ancient myths, legends, things like that, then just read this. Cannot recommend this enough. If you like this, it's not going to be for everyone though. If you're not into just like solid world building, don't bother with it. But if you do like that, then this is great. Right, the next one is something I read relatively recently. I think I read it December, something. And that is the Chronicles of the Black Company by Glen. This is actually like an omnibus edition of the first Black Company trilogy. There's like I think there may be like 10 Black Company novels. There could be more, at least 10. And this is the first 3 books in an omnibus edition. I think this is kind of the start of grimdark fantasy, really. But yeah, what these books do is they follow a mercenary company, seen through the eyes of this guy called Croker, who's like the mercenary company's medic. But the interesting thing about this one, I mean, it's quite an interesting world, and the plot is, yeah, you know, there's a lot of just typical fantasy stuff. But the interesting thing about this is the mercenaries in this one are fighting for the bad guys. So that's quite, you know, and I think when this was written, because it's not like that recent, it must be like the 1990s, maybe the 80s, I don't know. But anyway, I'm trying to find where, but I'll tell you if I find it. Oh, there you go, yeah, 1984. So yeah, I guess that's quite old. So I think this may have been the start of grimdark fantasy, but it really stands up to the test of time. I mean, the way that these mercenaries are portrayed, I mean, it's just fantastic. They're just, I mean, they don't care that they're fighting for the bad guys. You know, they might have a couple of thoughts where they're just like, are we doing the right thing? But then at the end of the day, they're just like, it's their job. That's just what they do. So that's a really cool take on it, I thought, and it's something that's been done since then, but this is the first one, and he does a really great job of it, so I'd definitely recommend that. This is a good one. This is the best. This is my favourite fantasy series of all time. It's the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. I've not even finished it yet. I've read there's 10 books in the main series, and then there's a bunch of like there's a couple of secondary series as well that I've not read any of. All of them are massive, like, you know, we're talking Wheel of Time size books. This is the first one. It is the Gardens of the Moon, or just Gardens of the Moon, in fact, and this is impossible to explain in briefly. it is just, there is so much going on in this. He creates Stephen Erikson, right? He's an anthropologist, and he's got a really keen grasp of what makes up history and different cultures, things like that. And like I say, there's just so much going on in this series that it's impossible to just break it down into a simple synopsis. But there's everything in this, you know. There's all different fantasy races, and they're all unique ones as well. We're not just talking like elves, dwarves, blah blah blah. They don't appear in this. You've got all different ones that are really unique that he's made up. Loads of different cultures with so much background to them. This whole world has got like just the entire history of it mapped out. The magic system is amazing. And what I really love about Stephen Erikson's writing is he treats you like a grown-up, do you know what I mean? He doesn't just, you know, give you these expository info dump type things. This book in particular, the first one in the series, you are just dropped right into it. And if you don't have the sort of persistence to, and the, you know, the intelligence to sit there and actually try and work out what's going on, you're not going to get anything from it. You're just going to read the first like few chapters and be like, what the hell? I don't understand what's going on. You have to really like think about this book to get anything from it. But if you do, it is like just staggering in the scope of the writing. I absolutely love it. I haven't, like I say, I've only read I've read 7 out of the 10 books so far. And I'm already thinking, like, as soon as I finish it, I'm going to reread it. Brilliant stuff. Next one, I'm not going to give a synopsis of it, but for a different reason, because everybody knows what's going on in it, and it is Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. If you don't know what happens in this, then where have you been for the last 8 years? And yeah, you know, the world building in this, again, yeah, really excellent world building. The plot is brilliant. I mean, based on the War of the Roses, I think, where there's loads of, you know, family infighting and whatever. But again, similar to the Joe Abercrombie stuff and the Scott Lynch stuff, what really makes this stand out is the characters. The characters are absolutely brilliant. Their motivations are just so well thought out. I mean, Martin does that better than pretty much anyone, I think. So yeah, if you haven't read these, then, you know, definitely read them. They're brilliant books, and just hopefully they end better than the TV series. You know, that was a disappointment, right? This is a good one. I mean, they're all good ones, but I really like this one. This is The Red Knight, which is the first book in the Traitor Son cycle by Miles Cameron. I recently did like an audiobook vlog about this. You can check out if you want. And Miles Cameron, if you haven't heard of him before, if you've read any historical fiction, you might know him as Christian Cameron. This Miles Cameron is the name he uses when he's writing fantasy. And this is it's another one like the Black Company series that follows a sort of morally grey mercenary company who, you know, in a fantasy world. And I think it's got, you know, a really good elements of it's kind of a combination of, you've got the grimdark, you know, but excellent rapport between the mercenary company characters that you've got in like the Glen Cook series and also in the Scott Lynch series. I think certainly the rapport between the characters is definitely up to those levels, in my opinion. And I think the world itself is a really interesting one. You've kind of got humanity pitted against monsters, but it's not really humanity. It's like civilization pitted against, you know, the wild, the wilderness, the other. And so, you know, some of the humans identify more with the wild than they do with humanity. So really, it's like civilization against the wild. And I think that the two things that really make this series stand out, as I've said, it's the rapport between the characters, which is brilliant. The characters themselves are just really well fleshed out, really well portrayed. And the other thing is the battle scenes. A lot of people find battle scenes really boring, and they can be if it's just he swung his sword and hit him, and then she swung her battle axe and hit him, whatever. But Miles Cameron really writes a fantastic battle scene, up there with Bernard Cornwell levels of, sort of blade to blade action. Definitely worth a read. This is a great series, honestly. There's like 5 books in it. They're all pretty big, but totally worth it. I didn't want to put them down. Right, and the last one, as I say, these are in no particular order, but the last one that I've got is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. But this is the first book, The Assassin's Apprentice, or just, I keep on putting the on the front of them. Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. And this follows the sort of, a bit of the life of a guy called Fitzchivalry Farseer, who's like a royal bastard, who is sort of trained up, as you guess from the title, he's trained up to be like an assassin. He's got like a bit of magic stuff going on. He's got like a magical wolf companion later in the series who's awesome. And it is written in the first person, which I really like, and you don't get a lot of in the fantasy genre, but I think it makes it like super immersive and engrossing. And I really think that Robin Hobb gets the most out of that first person perspective. And like I say, so it's a bit of a fresh air in that sense. So yeah, definitely worth a read. I've got the next trilogy. I mean, it's part of a larger series called The Realm of the Elderlings, which, I mean, I don't know how many books that's got, maybe like 16 or 17 books in it. I've only read the Farseer trilogy, as I say, but I do own the Live Ship Traders trilogy, which I am definitely going to be reading pretty soon. I did reviews of all the books in this, so you can check out if you want as well. So there you go. That was probably a bit of a long video, but I hope that there was something in there that you maybe haven't heard of that you can go and check out. And I also hope that there was some stuff in there that you might enjoy. If there's anything there that you have read and you've got any views on that you would disagree with me perhaps and say, oh yeah, I thought that was better than you said, or I thought that wasn't as good as you said, then please leave a comment. If there is something that I didn't mention that you think should be on this list, then I'm always up for recommendations. So please, recommend stuff to me. Like, what are your favourite fantasy books or fantasy series or fantasy authors, whatever. So I guess I'll be back with some reviews once I've finished cutting all the hay. And I've got a bit more time to do some reading. I am in the middle of a really good book at the moment, so look forward to a review on that when I finish it. But it is a massive book. It's like 900 pages long, so that will happen at some point. Anyway, until then, goodbye.